7 o'clock here. Seven o'clock here. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Lakewood City Council study session for this Monday, August 8, 2022. We have a number of items for discussion, the first of which is our annual meeting with the Public Safety Advisory Committee. And for this, I think I'll turn it over to, who's our chair? Is it you, Ken, or Alan? Alan. So Alan, go ahead and introduce the members of the committee that are here and lead us through the work plan.
Thank you. Directly opposite is Ken Whitko, our immediate previous chair. And then Karen Fiara, a relatively new member. And Ray Dodson, he's been with us for as long as I have. Our vice chair, Teresa King, isn't able to be here. Her father's on life support, and I guess they're coming to a decision point. So she sent me a note earlier today saying she wouldn't make it. And the other members, I don't know what happened to them. Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit about what our year has been. It's been fairly busy. We're continuing to monitor the railroad situation, particularly the Clover Creek crossing. I continue to see people walking on the roadway because there is no sidewalk, and creating a hazard for themselves and of course to the drivers, because it's unfortunate that some people seem to exceed the posted speed limit through there. We've talked about city parks safety. We had some suggestions on future changes to improve safety there. And actually, we felt the parks people were doing really an excellent job to plan for the future. We had a meeting on school zone cameras and red light cameras, understanding what the limitations are for those, although some of us would like to see more school zone cameras because it seems like there is a speeding problem through some school zones. There are restrictions that limit that, unfortunately. And we did a thorough fireworks education review, and we're pleased that the program that the City Council enacted a couple of years ago seems to be working. That's the general observation that there were fewer fireworks before and after the 4th, although the 4th seemed like it was unusually heavy. It seems like people were concentrating, which is probably a good thing. There are very few fireworks illegally set off on the 5th. So it seems like that program and the educational effort is working. So I continue to monitor that to make sure it doesn't slip back into people having bad habits. We're continuing to emphasize recruitment. We would like to diversify our committee more. There are some sections in or some demographics in our community that just have never been represented on our committee. And we'd like to get them representatives of those groups on if we could. And finally, the big project that we're working on right now is one we were just recently given on performing a business public safety survey, which we can talk more about if you wish. Anybody on any committee members have anything to add?
I'm sure we'll have questions around the room here from members of the council as we kind of go around, maybe questions or comments either on the 2022 tasks accomplished to date and those that are planned for the next year. Any thoughts, comments? Otherwise, I can open up a couple of questions if I don't see any other hands going on here. In terms of the public safety survey on businesses, as I hear you mention, what's the thought on how to structure that?
We have a subcommittee appointed to work on that. And we have a number of goals that we were talking about. We haven't finalized anything yet. I have talked with Linda Smith of the Chamber of Commerce, and I just set up a date to talk with Chief Sorrow to find out what his needs were. And we still plan to also set up a date with someone from West Pierce Fire and Rescue to find out what their information needs would be. The goals we've set up, and perhaps number one, is to show that the city is interested in and committed to small business and small business safety. We would like to see if we can identify, is there anything we are missing in protecting small businesses? Anything obvious that we're not doing that we should be doing? We'd like to ask the question, what would they like to do to protect themselves? What are they willing to do? Are they doing anything? Many businesses have cameras, but not all. And we'd also like to know what is not working. The police have had special emphasis programs and are continuing to have special emphasis programs, but what is not working? Some of the other comments that the committee has come up with is we'd like to tailor the questions, perhaps tailor the questions to the type of business. So maybe we can find out if there's if some of the issues are particular to a type of business, like a convenience store or something like that, or adult care or something like that, or the international businesses. We'd like to know what organizations do the businesses belong to, other than Chamber of Commerce. Do they have any organizations or informal organizations that might help in preparing programs to help themselves? We'd like to limit the survey to perhaps half a dozen to a dozen questions, and just to make sure that we don't overload them. And we'd like to identify, as far as possible, actionable items, things that, not just that what the businesses say, gee, we don't feel very safe in the evenings, but actually, are they reporting issues to the police? Do they have people just wandering around, hanging around, or are there things that actionable things that the police could actually do to make them feel safer? And I think that is one of the questions that we have been talking about are among them are, how do we do this? In talking with Linda Smith, she said the return on questionnaires or even email questionnaires is not very good, even for them. Although she did offer that if we wished, we could appear at some of their meetings and present a program and ask at that time, people hand out questionnaires or encourage people in other ways. Although she said there aren't all that many businesses that do show up at their meetings. One of the interesting ideas that has come out is that since there have been several forums, public forums, that seem to be moderately well attended in the park. Maybe we should consider the idea of having a public forum, but directed at particular groups of businesses, and specifically invite groups of businesses to come and meet and publicly discuss these issues. But that's where we are. We're still talking about how do we do this? How do we actually do it so we get a return, which would be significant. Even the city survey on the citizens was not well responsive.
Not robust. Yeah.
So we're wrestling with that. How do we make a difference? How do we do it differently?
Well, I think those are good comments, and I'll pass around the room. My thought is, from a goal perspective, the council and all the residents want the public at large to enjoy both the perception and the reality that Lakewood is a safe community, right? And we're working really hard to not only make that a reality, but to change the perception that has historically been here a little bit. And I think it's changed for the better. The business community, getting after them might be a collaborative function with your group through the police department and Becky Newton with the economic development team to figure out how best to reach out to businesses and capture the information on what is of concern to them, if anything. I think there are concerns because I get calls. My day job, I represent a lot of business owners, and I get calls about issues involving trespass on their property or knucklehead activity occurring on or around their premises, sometimes on the right of way, spilling over into their properties. The opportunity to trespass, how to effectively or better utilize the My Lakewood 311, those kinds of tools can be used to engage the business community perhaps better. I think there are issues on loss prevention. When I went on a ride along, I chatted with some owners at, for example, CVS, not owners, but staff members at CVS Pharmacy. And they typically will say that the crazy behavior occurs, between 11, not that it can't occur at all times of the day, but 11 through 1, 2, or whatever in the morning. Are there need for increased presence patrols? Is that the perception from the business community? What are they doing to enhance their own security? Those kinds of things. So getting a handle on that, I think, would be a positive deal from my humble perspective, informed by some of my business clients and chatting with folks. Councilor Bell, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about, you said that you have recruitment as a continuing effort. So I was wondering how the recruitment was going to expand your reach, and have you seen returns on that?
No, we're just doing it informally. We're trying to talk to people and make a network so we can get people from preferably the Asian community, because we've never had Asians at an Asian member, anyone from that community. But yeah, it's mainly just informal.
Mr. Boki.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. Could you talk a little bit more about, you mentioned city park safety, future changes to enhance safety, and you made some remarks that you thought the parks were doing a good job. Can you expound upon that a little bit?
Yeah, Mary Dodsworth came and talked with us one evening. We had a very good exchange with her, particularly at American Lake. There was some problem with the park just becomes overcrowded, and if some incident occurs, it's very difficult for the police to really get in there. It's just too blasted many people. So they have some plans, which we really encourage, to expand parking. And she had some other plans about expanding parking perhaps across the road or something like that. some other areas to provide better access. But that's going to be a tough nut to crack. It's going to be expensive. Start talking about wanting to add property to the park, and yeah, that's going to be very expensive. But we had a lively discussion about what to do about that, because it is a problem. We're a lot less concerned about Lake Steilacoom Park now because there seem to be relatively few calls for service, police service at for Steilacoom, but and they've done a tremendous job opening up, providing access and facilities at that park. So if we could just expand that, and Mary Dosworth was talking about the getting grants to help that process, which we would really support. Anyone have anything to add? Ken?
Anything else to discuss or direct with regard to the work plan? Mr. Anderson, any comments? Good.
For the next year, do you have any ideas or suggestions for initiatives that your committee could take on outside the scope of traditional law enforcement, general safety in the community?
We haven't talked about it, but it's an interesting idea. We can definitely add that. A personal comment that I have is that our community outreach program has diminished. Some of us were at night out, some of the neighbors were talking about that we don't have the neighborhood meetings that we used to have. And don't see we don't have the same level of interaction that we used to have. And that was something they brought to me as their representative on PSAC. And I made a note of that, but we haven't talked about it yet. But we'd like to do something. I'd like to do something. Revitalize that.
Yeah, it would be kind of nice to get a better handle on the scope coming out of the last 2 years of the COVID pandemic. What neighborhood associations are actually up and running and strong, and which ones have kind of fallen by the wayside, and how can we help them reinvigorate themselves? Because that's where you guys really shined, I thought, was participation in those neighborhood committee meetings. They had the patrol officers there and certainly members of West Pierce and the school district. And it was a really informative sort of two-way info gathering opportunity for both the residents in the area and members of your committee and other city staffers. So
Yeah.
hopefully we can get a handle on who's doing what.
Yeah, the neighborhood associations are slowly getting going again, but
Mhm.
not all of them,
Right.
which is a definite loss. And I'm not sure how we would reinvigorate them. I'd like to see more community activity, but it may take a bit.
It might flow organically from the national night out groups, geographically, and then from those groups, eventually they might form or at least reinvigorate the association. And then from those organizations, you might get more members, hopefully from a diverse set of groups around the community, diverse members to your committee. I think it has to flow somewhat organically from the neighborhoods.
I've not seen any numbers now on how many night out gatherings there were. In our area, there was only one, and that's down from nor we had in the past.
The chief might be able to speak to that briefly. I don't know, but we had a fair list of National Night Out participant neighborhood and association groups, if you will. How does that compare historically?
Better than the last 2 years,
Right.
but
historically, I mean, you're some years with 40 and 50 events.
Right. Well, that may be a task in itself to kind of work on educating the community about the wonderful opportunity to get to know one another and maybe make that a priority for 2023 and focus on getting the neighborhood association meetings together. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, you know, one of the things about the neighborhood associations and where we expect a neighborhood association to emerge and be there is, goes back to 20 years ago when we created some because of a federal weed and seed grant program where you had to have some neighborhood impact into this going over there. And so we went out and we worked to create them, one in each police district. And that didn't necessarily, but and we've kept trying to keep that model together, and it hasn't gelled everywhere. That, but we have also never, as a city, put out to the community that said, this is what it would take if you want to be recognized as a neighborhood association and have a partnership with the city where you would get city representation at your meetings or a liaison or in a conduit to voice problems. And that maybe is something that this committee might be able to come up with a template that if we put that out there, then we might get some of the groups like we saw it traditionally National Night Out Against Crime or other things that would like to do that, meeting monthly or bi-monthly or quarterly, but that would perhaps get some new blood going in that way to do that, rather than to expect that the Southgate Neighborhood Association will ever reemerge from, you know, like a Leviathan, you know. So that may be something if they could give us some recommendations that then we might be able to do to incentivize groups to form and be a neighborhood association, perhaps for smaller neighborhoods than we've traditionally had. That would help to do that.
Good points. Councilmember Farmer.
So I was going to ask a couple of other questions, but this conversation has really piqued my interest. I'm curious who at the city here owns the neighborhood groups, if any, if they're created out of our police districts. Is there a liaison within the police department? Do we have that kind of a lens on our neighborhood groups? If not, maybe we ought to think, what's the purpose of having our groups together? If we're going to go at them with a public safety lens, or do we want to go at them with the, hey, let's all get together and be more in community? I think the message that we send and how we're organized is important. So I'm really interested also in best practices. I'm curious what AWC might say and how other cities are organized, particularly, let's see, city to the north. Go ahead.
I was going to say there's a lot of great neighborhood programs that are already developed and out there that we could probably look to lean on to, and some of them are just neighborhood programs that just focus on organizing the HOAs, things like that. And then there's always a public safety kind of side that usually focuses a lot on, how to keep your house safe, your neighborhood safe. So it's a blend. I'm not sure, like Councilmember Farmer mentioned, whose that is here at the city. but it would be something to look into, and most of it is pretty much developed. We could look to other people for the templates.
Mr. Branstetter.
Yeah, well, I think that that's true, that there are lots of models in communities that have robust or active neighborhood groups by whatever name that they are. Most of the ones that I know of are also resourced. They have they get some resources from the city, that they have some ability to either recommend or spend to make neighborhoods stronger. That we've never gone that route, or other than for a couple of times, 12 years ago or so, where we gave some small grants to some neighborhood associations to do that, but not on an ongoing basis. So it, is, we're getting what we paying for.
Yeah, I get it, yeah. Yes, Councilmember?
Okay, out of my other questions. I am curious about, in your current work plan, item number 6, a trash issue as a public safety issue. I'm interested in knowing more about that. And then number 8, adult family homes.
No, we haven't gotten to number 8 yet. Okay. Yes, we just had the trash issue last week. That was an issue brought up by our Vice Chair, Teresa King, and Ms. Ferrara. They were concerned about, what's happening with trash on the streets. So the Public Works manager came and talked with us last week, gave a very good presentation about their program and what they're doing. And put in a comment that they've been understaffed because of some problems with COVID. I guess like every place else, they're behind. But it was very interesting, particularly since it does seem that it is contained in certain areas. It seems like, yeah, it's just contained in certain areas, and it's a difficult thing to do because it's hard to catch people who are consistent offenders on the trash.
Is it illegal dumping, or is it more of a trash, like somebody tosses their McDonald's bag out the window? Or are we talking large chunks of things like furniture?
Yeah, it's a bit of everything.
Everything.
Everything from the dead squirrel on the street outside to the roofer at midnight who doesn't want to properly dispose of his load of roofing, or the landscaper, and goes down a road with a dark road and leaves a little small gift, a truckload. So yeah, it runs the gamut. Some of the problems that we were complaining about are not on city property. So they are limited to city property, street right-of-ways, parks, and so forth. So some of the issues we have, like in town center, there's some of the internal streets get pretty bad sometimes, and those are not the city responsibilities. So they're saying, okay, we can't really do anything about it. They do pass complaints along, try to get something done, but they're not responsible. But it also highlights the effectiveness of the 311 system that really is working, that they do get at least problems that are identified by citizens do get on a list. It may take a a day or two or even three, but they do get addressed. They are not forgotten.
Thank you.
Anything else for the good of the order? Yeah, trash in the public right of way is always an irritant for everyone, right? So hopefully we're doing a pretty good job of that in some rights of way. I'm always a little bit interested in what's going on 100th, from South Tacoma way down as you come into the city. That's always one that looks like it could use a little attention, but anyway, it's the small things that matter, right? Well, very good. Well, thank you. Anything, Ken, for the good of the order, from your perspective? Don't want to leave you out. Okay.
If I might just say one thing about the fireworks, which we worked on for several years, the city finalized a ordinance about that. So I drove around on 4th of July evening, just around my neighborhood, because I was under the impression that things were much louder on the 4th than they were in previous years. So I took a couple pictures of ordinance displays, and it was pretty impressive what I saw. So, and it was as loud as, and anyway, it was very, so that is to say that apparently people are saying, well, we can't do this on the 3rd and the 5th, so I'm just going to buy the whole truckload and do it on the 4th. And so they do. And they were blocking the streets, and it was very, very impressive. So, but I think it's still a good thing, kind of limited the scope of that. So, and I have pictures if you'd like to see that,
Well, I heard that the drone show at Summerfest, well, I watched it, but I heard many good comments about that as a beginning possible substitution for public displays. So that's a good thing. Well, thanks again for coming, all of you, and for spending part of your evening with us. We appreciate your work on the committee and look forward to further input on the work plan as we move forward collectively in the next year. Yeah, very good. Good to see you. Thanks. Welcome. Well, next we are excited to have our members of the Planning Commission come before us tonight, along with Mr. Buer and our planning manager, Courtney Brunel, to give us an overview of the tree preservation code updates, which have been a work in progress. And I believe we also have Lisa Gruder from Burke and Associates. Thank you for coming. I think the floor is Ms. Brunel.
Good evening, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, members of the council. I am going to hand it over and thank Mr. Daniels and Mr. Pearsons for being here, who are going to introduce the tree preservation code update before the Planning Commission.
Great.
Thank you, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, Council. Thank you, Don Daniels, citizen and the Chair of the Planning Commission. And we have next to us the Vice Chair, Mr. Ryan Pearson. So I'm just going to cover some highlighted items on that draft resolution that we sent to the resolution 2022-07 on the tree preservation code. First of all, I want to thank the tree ad hoc committee. Without them giving us something, we would still be deliberating over this issue. So I want to thank them, all the consulting groups that were involved. Staff, of course, did a wonderful job, and my fellow commissioners as well. It was a real effort, team effort. We had many things to consider on this issue. We've had many comments from citizens, either in person, writing, all of those. We had many developers, construction companies. It was something to deal with the staff all the time when we fellow commissioners would ask a question or a concern. They would always come back with not only just the answer, but some detailed information above and beyond what we really asked them. So they did many comparisons to our fellow cities in neighboring cities around us. Which was very helpful to make a decision or a recommendation moving forward. We also had to, their time, like I said, we spent the last all 3 times in June and 3 times in July, an extra meeting just to basically talk this whole tree preservation code. We also had to consider the cost. I mean, that was one thing that the ad hoc committee really probably didn't get involved in, what this whole thing is going to cost. So we looked at that. We also had to work in conjunction with the climate change plan, the climate change plan that is before you as well. So we had to make sure that those things match the tree preservation code and the climate change. Like I mentioned, we compared it to surrounding cities. We knew that the very important thing was protect the Gary oak or the white oaks. We made sure that there was an education plan that was, we felt that it was required because it's going to take some real education of the citizens here. So we wanted to make sure that. And I think that these were measurable goals that we proposed because we wanted to see after 1 year how it's really working. So I think these are very realistic, measurable goals that we can look at and say, hey, this worked, this didn't work. Here's some of those measurable percentages and goals. And then we can make some changes after that, if it worked or not worked. But there again, we just wanted to make sure that we asked ourselves, I did personally, asked myself, is it going to be fair to all concerned? And that was a hard question to answer. But I think realistic wise, when you get into the whole details, I think it's pretty fair to everyone that became or had the stakeholders that are involved in this. So that was my perspective of this whole process. There again, I thank the staff and my fellow commissioners. I'll turn it over to Mr. Pearson.
Thanks. So a couple of the, I would say, takeaways from this whole process. It really seemed like, a portion of the community was well represented with, the people who are more concerned with the trees and the Gary oak specifically. And there wasn't a whole lot of representation from folks that were, maybe from the development community. And, we didn't get a whole lot of input as far as maybe how certain things could affect, like warehousing or these different things. So I didn't hear a whole lot on that side of the fence. So I just would make note of that. And then, one of the items that really kind of snowballed and took off was we all seemed to really get on board with this, kind of like if you doing some preservation and getting, some additional density out of things, incentivizing, gosh, I couldn't think of the word, but really incentivizing it. And I think that was pretty much unanimous with the planning commission members, that everyone was generally in support of, doing some more incentivizing, maybe reducing some barking, but allowing for some added density in some areas to protect some trees, or additional impervious, or, just kind of being a little bit more flexible. So that was, I thought, a valuable part to this. There's definitely the two sides of it. You have the folks that are gung-ho that want all of the trees protected, and then you have, like I said, I didn't really hear the whole kind of like the other side of it. I think a lot of folks are, everyone wants to protect the trees and do some things that are reasonable. The one item as well is that I took away from hearing with staff is that, kind of anything that we do additionally than what we're doing now was going to require additional staff or some sort of additional funds. And so that's where, you guys would come in as decision makers with that sort of thing. It looked like, I think what we
had kind of proposed was going to be somewhere on the order of like one city staff, or some part-time consultants at least, or some combination of the two. So I think going, changing from what we're doing now to getting more, more of these tree permits and doing that stuff is going to result in added staff. And that's something that we tried to, kind of tease out as best we could. But so yeah, those are kind of the big ticket items that I would comment on.
Ms. Courtney? Go ahead.
Yes, thank you again for being here to give us an introduction and a summary of what we did in front of the Planning Commission. Tonight, I am joined again by Ms. Lisa Greeter, who is with Burke Consulting. Lisa served as the project manager with the consulting team, and her and partner with Planet Geo, Alex Hancock, were the folks that were able to deliver a lot of those comparisons that we presented in front of the Planning Commission. Tonight, Lisa is going to start to guide us through this PowerPoint presentation. But before we went there, I wanted to briefly summarize some of the memo contents that aren't specifically called out in the PowerPoint. The memo begins on page 5 of the council packet, and 5 to 10, we're going to review in quite some detail. So skipping ahead a little bit, if you go to pages 10 through 12, we have taken a look at some other jurisdictions that were considered similar to Lakewood to compare tree canopy goals and tree protection codes. On page 15 of the council packet, specifically table 6, we have collected and hyperlinked the resources that were considered by the ad hoc committee, the planning commission, as well as just general resources that are referenced throughout all of the documents that you'll be seeing tonight and in the future. And our original goal was to have the code update completed by August. As you can see, the ad hoc committee and the planning commission both requested some additional time and additional meetings to review all of the materials, totaling 7 meetings each. On page 16 of the packet, we've provided some proposed next steps. If the council would like to finish the update by September, this would be a potential path. We are currently scheduled to be back before you on August 22nd, and during that meeting, we will respond to the questions that we received tonight, and we will be joined by Planet Geo, who are the certified arborists and subject matter experts on a variety of specific urban forestry topics. During the PowerPoint, we've taken a summary of the red lines and compared that to the ad hoc committee recommendations and the planning commission recommendations. The full proposed red lines are attached to the resolution and begin on page 22 of your packet. So with that, I will turn it over to Lisa.
So I assume we'll get there, but is it correct that we're going to go down through the key issues 1 through 12 in some sort of, here's the issue, here was the recommendation, here's the context, and here's the planning committee's recommendation?
Yes.
Okay, that would be really great because that'll be a structured way to think through it.
That was a
given the
great
overview.
introduction.
Yeah.
Thanks, Courtney. And thank you to the council. So as Courtney mentioned, we're going to go through some background material, but then as we go through the code review, we will be stepping through those 12 key issues that form the basis for the review by both the ad hoc committee and the planning commission. We'll touch briefly on the public participation plan. And as Courtney mentioned, you've got red lines. So just as the background, last fall, I believe this issue became of interest to a number of community members and came as a subject before the city council. And the city council directed the city manager to complete a review of the tree preservation code and the associated chapters. And the council approved a scope of work and a public participation plan in November. And then you seated the ad hoc committee based on a resolution that you put together. They were seated by February of this year. Briefly, the scope of the code review that was part of the scope approved in November last year was sort of in 2 parts. One was to do a tree canopy situation assessment. That was to do a cover analysis that would help inform the how well the city was doing in terms of equity, where trees are located in terms of vulnerable communities, and also could form the basis for tree canopy goals and the tree preservation code. The second part was to do an evaluation of the code itself, and that was based on a best practices review by, as Courtney mentioned, Planet Geo, who's our subject matter experts, but also to come forward with issues and options. So that's where we brought in the examples from other jurisdictions, look at permit procedures and fees, and that's part of the key issues that are before you. And then identify if there's any coordinating changes with the comprehensive plan or other regulations. And depending on the nature of those changes, they can be packaged together with the tree code update, or with the comprehensive plan could be phased with your next docket. The public participation plan in summary had a few different steps to it. One was awareness and advertising. That would be through the project website and also direct emails to stakeholder groups and so on. The formation of the ad hoc advisory committee, and then some targeted outreach, stakeholder interviews and discussion groups. That also included a survey. And then some comment collections. We did the survey, we did tree talks. Those were 1 hour virtual meetings that were posted on YouTube. And then a tree tour, that was a live in-person tree tour in early June. And a postcard that went to, I believe, every residential address or every address, residential or commercial in the city. And then the legislative meeting process, which, as the planning commissioners noted, garnered, several hundred pages of comment letters that came for review. So here we go into some of the recommendations. So key issue number 1 was around that first part of the scope, which was a tree canopy goal. And the current policy in the comprehensive plan does not have a numeric target for tree canopy goal. It does speak to preserving significant trees and expanding tree coverage throughout the city. So that's your goal LU 60 there on that left-hand side. The ad hoc committee looked at a range of options. They looked at no net loss of tree canopy, and which is about 26% today as measured in the tree canopy analysis. They also looked at 35% and 40% goals, and they recommended adding a policy underneath goal LU 60 for a 40% tree canopy goal. The Planning Commission considered that recommendation. They looked at a range of targets. They looked at a number of cities and considered and recommended 30% as the goal. And that would be consistent. Having a tree canopy goal would be consistent with that current goal LU 60, which talks about an urban forestry program to preserve trees and promote and expand tree coverage. And it's important to note the tree canopy goal is not meant to be achieved on every single property. It's really a broad goal that can help the city align resources. So if that is a voluntary program, free trees, some communities send out trees, some would promote tree canopy protection, as well as adding trees in heat islands, so on the big parking lot areas. So there's a number of ways that that tree canopy goal could be accomplished. So that's important to note because a lot of the other recommendations are really about the tree canopy regulations.
So just so we're on the same sheet, how was it measured for a base starting point? And generally for policymakers, how are tree canopies measured in municipalities?
Okay. The approach was to use a land cover analysis with pretty high resolution aerial photography. And it's detailed in the packet materials and we can bring it forward, but it is pretty high resolution. And it was looked at over a 10-year period. And I believe 2019 is that 26% that we looked at. And you actually citywide had a slight increase in tree canopy
Over the course of
over the
19.
course of 10 years.
Right.
And it's, there are some, but they also looked at it by zone. And you had a little bit of loss in like your rights of way. So some potentially street trees and things like that. Other areas you had a gain. And that led you to that overall number. And the methodology that was used is pretty common in the state. And I think the Department of Natural Resources has an issue paper around how to do it. And
I was always thinking historically, when you go back to Lakewood's genesis as an area, it was the prairie. And I would think that you look back at, turn of the century compared to now, we've got to have improved somewhat over the course of time. Just given the desire for neighborhoods to grow and to plant mature plantings over the course of time. So from the prairie to now, as opposed to from 2019 to now, we've probably come a long way.
I would imagine that's true. And the city has certainly changed a lot since it was founded.
I would think, yeah. Ryan and then Mr. Branstad.
I can just clarify a little. So I think another thing you were kind of getting on was, so their measurements, and I believe it was like 12 feet. Anything that was 12 feet and higher was considered a tree, and below that wasn't included. So that's helps provide a little bit of, that gives you an idea of what is actually a tree in their report. And that's all very detailed in the plan and geo.
Yeah, so it could be arborvitaes or
Yeah.
whatever, just got to a certain height. Mr. Branstad. Mr. Branstad.
Yeah, and I understand the recommendation, the planning commission's target is a 30% coverage. Ad hoc committee had a slightly higher range to be able to go and do that. And I certainly understand that it isn't a per property, it's for Lakewood, right? The overall thing. But in between those two, there is a question of we have got some communities, particularly on the eastern side, that I think while we're at 26 now, that they're at significantly less than that, and that so is there room to set a goal for some sub areas to say that all the sub areas will at least get to 25 or 20 while the city is working to get to 30 in kind of an equity consideration to put into the program. And I noticed in your slide you talked about, well, let's do things on the eastern side and places to do that, which seems to be an awareness of that. But I wouldn't want to get to 30 and pat ourselves on the back because we planted a lot of trees in Fort Silicon Park or something like that. I think that there is a concern in the community that we heard a year ago when this conversations were first percolating, that there was a perception that certain neighborhoods that were more low of our low income areas were losing trees faster than other parts of the city, even while other parts of the city might have been gaining trees. Having just a community goal without some sub-area goals of where if we identify some sub-areas that are quite deficient in canopy, might be a balance that would ensure that we go about things, in an equitable manner.
A consideration that was made by the Planning Commission and the Ad Hoc Committee. There's information that are linked in your packet that show the census blocks that have more or less tree canopy and are scoring at a lower level, and they tend to be in areas that are lower income or with people of color. There is in your red lines on page 18 the actual policy language, LU 60.4, that go beyond just the 30% number. It talks about considering opportunities to increase canopy and environmental equity when evaluating tree canopy distribution. And so we'll bring back at your next meeting that additional information that I think will show you how it was considered by the Planning Commission. And the idea is to consider equity when figuring out how to prioritize resources for tree canopy.
I had read that, but I do think I would be more comfortable with having a 30% tree canopy, but with but also a minimum tree canopy number for census tracts. That would not wanting to get to 30% and then say all is good, but to actually have a goal for the places that are significantly deficient now. That would allow future councils as 2050 approaches to have some sort of a goal to keep working towards.
Mr. Anderson.
Yeah, perhaps you can point me at it, but I'm a bit concerned that there doesn't seem to be any meaningful economic analysis of the impacts. There's some easy ones you can look at, like it's going to cost people for arborists. That if you have less intense development, it tends to drive up the price of the property. It costs more per unit. But when we talk about what I call geographic equity, the housing stock controls the tree cover. It's not that people are going into lower income neighborhoods and cutting down all the trees. You have fully developed, older, higher density residences that have existed, and that lower cost of housing attracts lower income people. It's a very simple economic equation. So if we look at the equity, I think we should focus on finding places to plant trees. We can't afford as a city to pay for lower density. We wouldn't comply with the GMA anyway. So it'd be really easy to, if you had unlimited funds, to go in and create open spaces in lower income neighborhoods, and then they won't be lower income neighborhoods anymore. Because it's going to drive up the price, because there's going to be less housing and the rents will go up. So, it's a be careful what you wish for kind of thing. So just like to see, to the extent we're looking at that, look at, existing opportunities and limit the opportunity for mischief in requiring the city to spend a lot of money to get there.
That's kind of a broad comment on all the items. I know we want to kind of methodically walk through 1 through 12 here. In response to Mr. Branstadter's comment on the geographic equity, many of these comments from my perspective came to us as a result of what has been zoned as light industrial, right, in the Springbrook neighborhoods, which happens to have some additional low-income housing as a result of it. But the work that promulgated much of the concern was in areas that were zoned to be something other than residential. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
Right. And I think in many, and I'm just talking off the top of my head a little bit, but in many of the areas around the city, including the Springbrook and Tillicum neighborhoods, the city has done good work in establishing open spaces by way of purchasing, acquiring lands for parks into which we can perhaps focus some efforts with regard to canopy development. Springbrook Park, Wards Lake Park, Harry Todd Park, American Lake Park, you know, those kinds of things. So anyway, anecdotal comment in response to the others we've heard, but I don't want to derail you from going through this methodically. So please proceed.
I actually think that's a great segue. For key issue item number 2, we get into the exemptions. And this was another item that was of key concern. And in addition to those industrial exemptions, we also have the exemption today for single-family residential lots under 17,000 square feet. And single-family residential lots under 17,000 square feet today make up the majority of the city's tree canopy. And next week, hearing the discussion, we'll bring forward those maps so you can see the actual statistics. But the majority of today's tree canopy is found in the residential zones, which isn't really too much of a surprise. There's less parking lot requirements, for example, in those zones. So with that, the ad hoc committee recommendation compared to our current policy is that we strike away the residential lot exemption in its entirety, meaning that we would require tree removal permits and mitigation for any tree to be removed on any single family residential lot. The Planning Commission looked through that recommendation, and after evaluating what other cities do and some of the options that were presented, they suggested that we keep the 17,000 square foot lot exemption with the exception of Oregon white oak trees. So instead of having that exemption apply to all tree species, that exemption would apply to all but Oregon white oaks. And for Oregon white oak trees, we would have a separate set of permit criteria. And that permit criteria would be a relatively simple process that we'll detail a little bit more later on. But it's worth mentioning that other jurisdictions have similar processes. And one of the problems that we have today is that we have a maximum number of trees that can be removed on single family residential lots, even over the 17,000 square foot marker, and we have no way to track it if no permits required. So over time, in a 5-year period, for example, an individual might come in and exceed that threshold. And without having some type of GIS data or permit tracking system, we wouldn't be able to know. So with this recommendation, there would be no exemption for Oregon white oak trees on any size single-family residential lot, but all other tree species would continue to be exempt.
Question on that. I know you're going to get into next week some of the parameters of the possible criteria. Questions have arisen such as, so I've got an Oregon white oak in the middle of my buildable lot.
Mhm.
And anecdotally, people are hearing, gee, I can't do anything within the drip zone of that tree.
Mhm.
How am I ever going to develop the lot? So is it true that some of the work you're going to be providing us that discusses the potential opportunity for a permit?
Yes, that
Will
is
address
true.
some of those issues?
Yep, and we have some scenarios at the end of the presentation, and that is one of the scenarios for how we would be able to work through some of the different permitting scenarios on both single-family residential lots as well as commercial and industrial development.
Okay, and then the other, I'm sorry to butt in here, but I'm going to. With regard to the favoritism, if you will, for Oregon white oak, we all know that that was of great concern to many members of the community. We've also heard that it isn't an endangered species or protected species under state law, correct?
It's a priority habitat under state law. So the
Okay.
Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife does recognize Oregon white oaks as a priority habitat. And in our critical areas ordinance today, we also recognize it as a species as being a critical area.
Okay.
It's defined differently in the WDFW recommendations versus our city code, which is another item that was a key issue.
So would this and try to make it consistent with that recognition under state law or not?
That was a recommendation from the ad hoc committee that was not carried forward by the planning commission recommendation.
And
So-
what's the impact of that potentially?
Well, we've had several hearing examiner decisions recently regarding this issue, and ultimately cities are able to adopt separate definitions of critical areas for priority habitats, for local priority habitats, not protected species.
Got it.
But there
It's
is
a
that,
completely
yep,
different
they're
definition.
different.
Okay, sorry. Mr. Anderson and Mr. Branstetter. I'm just getting educated and hope my questions help the group. So,
With respect to the recommended exemption for other than oaks, how is subdivision treated? So you go from having, we don't have 10 acre, green acre sitting around in development. Suppose you put in 15,000 or less square feet lots. Is each one of them exempt? Is it exempt if they resell them, sell them to different developers?
The way that the code is today, and there's not much of a proposed change here, it depends on the type of subdivision. So for a short plat that's exempt from SEPA, if those lots ended up being less than 17,000 square feet, yes, those trees would be exempt from protection. If SEPA is required, or so if there's any other critical area on site, or if it's a standard plat, then tree protection is required, additional tree protection.
So, but currently you can go up, how many lots on the short plat?
9.
9. So in theory, you could have a 3-acre parcel short platted into 17,000 square foot lots
Mhm.
and clear cut it.
Correct,
Well,
under the current code.
What about the change where there's no exemption for,
Under the change for anything that was not an Oregon white oak, that would continue. We didn't propose any changes to that yet.
okay. Okay, let me just be sure that I heard that correctly.
Yes.
So if something is short platted or subdivided, okay, and there are a large parcel is converted into smaller lots. As it is now, you'd be able to cut down every tree on it. But the recommendation is you could cut down every tree, but you'd need to get a permit to justify cutting down an Oregon white oak.
Correct, and mitigation may be
That's the
required.
recommendation from the planning commission.
And it would be once those lots were subdivided. So it wouldn't be for a preliminary short plat approval. It would be after the lots were officially subdivided and under 17,000 square feet, then yes, this exemption doesn't
Yeah,
apply.
yeah, but typically things don't get clear cut till after the plat is approved and the lots exist, although there's nothing on them, but to be able to go and do that. In the recommendation, and maybe it's in the details about what size Oregon white oak. I mean, I cut down several hundred Oregon white oaks with my lawnmower every year.
And code enforcement will be by next week.
The WDFW recommendations define large oaks as anything over 20 inches in diameter.
Okay, over 20 inches. Okay, and then I guess my question is, that I understand Oregon white oaks are sort of in this odd state thing as protected habitat, although the species itself is not endangered or protected.
It's a priority habitat, not a
Yeah.
protected species.
But are there trees in Washington that have a higher level of protection? You know, I don't know whether that there are some trees that I think there may be having the exception for Oregon white oaks, but maybe also for any tree that has got a certain level of protection at the state level. And I don't have an example other than that I can imagine that there are some.
None that I'm aware of, but we'll look and bring that back on August 22nd.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
And just to make sure we're all getting our definitions correct, you say protected species? That can apply to one tree as opposed to a group? Okay,
So protected species are typically we call them the critters casually. So animals that you know as protected species that are designated by WDFW. And then priority habitat
oh,
is
excuse me.
a
Mhm.
separate
Mhm.
list of items that cities can choose whether or not they want to adopt them as centers or as local priority habitats.
Okay, when I hear a priority habitat, can one tree qualify as a priority habitat, or is that to me? Two or more, three or more?
Okay, according to the WDFW definition, yes. By our definition today and the proposed by the Planning Commission, no. An individual tree could not be considered a priority habitat or a critical area.
Okay, so notwithstanding that, the planning commission's recommendation on key issue number 2 would be to have no exemption for a single non-priority habitat, Oregon white oak.
Meaning that a permit would be required. So this exemption, think of it in two categories,
Yeah.
no permit required, permit required.
Okay,
For single-family residential lots under 17,000 square feet, no permit is required to remove however many trees they would like to on that
other
lot,
than,
except for Oregon white oaks. And that would be a significant Oregon white oak, which is proposed to be 4 inches or greater. So to remove a 4-inch or more
got it.
significant white oak, you would have a permit, and then we would have a different set of criteria depending on the number of oak trees that you'd be looking to remove.
Got it, okay. That's helpful, thank you. So Mr. Bransteter's mowing operation for the small seedlings,
He's okay.
he's okay.
And we can bring back at your next meeting, there's been a number of comparisons that we brought forward for the planning commission on the Oregon white oak regulation of trees as significant trees, not necessarily critical areas. And so that'll come next time. So the other exemption that the ad hoc committee considered, as well as the planning commission, was the exemption for industrially zoned properties. Today it is exempt. The ad hoc committee and planning commission both recommended no exemption. That would be similar to how the city treated industrial lots a couple years ago. What this could do is give process and criteria that can help both applicants and the community, so that it's a little bit more grounded around the criteria for approval rather than the SEPA process, which is a longer, potentially more expensive and less certain process.
And I'm assuming the process would be limited to an administrative decision by staff under the community director.
Again, this would be the difference between is a permit required or not required. And so what this would say is compared to today, no permit is required in an industrial zone unless a condition of SEPA. And so new development typically would be triggered by SEPA, but if there's an existing industrial lot and they want to remove additional trees, they would not be required to have a permit. This would change that and require that there be some permit review criteria also included in the code. So we would go back similar to prior to 2020, when we had a certain amount of preservation criteria and mitigation standards for industrial lots, regardless of SEPA.
And subject to appeal.
Yes. Administrative decision.
Okay. Mr. Anderson.
So kind of a personal example, moving away from Oregon white oaks to just significant tree. I live on a half-acre lot, so I'm not 17,000 square feet. And there are a number of very large 100-year-old plus maple trees. They're much prettier trees. The squirrels like them, the owls like them, just as well as the oak. Provide more shade. They're better looking. What's going to happen if I need to take one of those out? And is there anything different between that and the ever prevalent invasive species Douglas fir that's right next to it?
You would be able to take down a certain number without needing to provide for any mitigation. And then if you reached above a threshold, we would require a certain amount of mitigation on site or off site. What would change under the proposed code is that we would have a simple permit required, basically a notification process required to confirm that you haven't exceeded that amount over the set amount of years. And then you would be free to go on your way and remove those trees. And if you had exceeded that amount, we would say you've already removed this many trees and mitigation is now required.
So second question is, in my past life in legal practice, there there are boundary line disputes and then there are boundary line cooperation. And it's amazing how many times the tree's on the line. Usually it's two doctors living on a lake and one wants to take it down and one doesn't. But, and they have money and they fight each other. But if they want to take it down, what's the, and you have two 15,000 square foot lots, or you have the little lots on Lake Stilican that are narrow. And they don't come up to that. You add the two together, there's you cut down half a tree. I mean, what's?
I probably wouldn't know, and I would consider that personally a civil dispute and
yeah.
say that it's two separate
Ask
lots
the
that
mayor,
are under
it's
the
amazing how
threshold.
often it comes up.
For that reason, some cities have a permit that normally would be exempt for the small lots when a tree is on a boundary line. I think probably because
Yeah, we don't have that permit today, but
It's-
Just to follow up on Mr. Anderson's personal example, later on in the discussion here, there's a discussion about a heritage tree programs, which are not necessarily, which a 100-year-old maple might end up being a heritage tree. And that, well, there's no specific recommendations about the rules around heritage trees. Because it's to be developed along with going forward. The recommendation is to have a heritage tree program. But in other communities, do heritage tree programs, are they more like, do they provide the kind of protection that where you can't cut them down? And would those become, depending on what criteria we choose, would we get trees of various species that would fall into that? And I think we're more looking at what happens in other communities because we don't have such a program.
so for the heritage tree recommendation, there are some proposed red lines to the existing protection and preservation of landmarks chapter 2.48. Essentially, it would create a new, and this is a separate key issue, so we'll go over it in more detail in a little bit. But we would create a new section similar to a Lakewood landmark for trees. And then there is also some draft language in the tree preservation code that outlines the process to allow for those to be removed.
Great. At least this number 3 seems pretty straightforward. We can agree.
Key issue number 4, this pertains to easements and rights of way. Currently, trees found in the easements or rights of way are exempt from, again, tree preservation criteria and permitting. The ad hoc committee recommendation was to remove the exemption and meet similar standards as what you would find on a public or private parcel. They also wanted to ensure that we included a definition for trimming and pruning, and that there's a special emphasis put on Gary oak trees and trimming and pruning of those trees. The Planning Commission recommendation was to keep the exemption aside from Oregon white oaks, again, similar to what's found in residential zones. So for future utility or rights of way projects, public works projects, any Gary oak that is removed, mitigation would be required. There would still be a process for permitting those removals, but there would be some type of mitigation rather than just allowing for the trees to be removed.
Mr. Brokey.
So this includes the city as well as utilities.
Yes.
So my thoughts on utilities are always, they're always 3 steps ahead of local government, right? They've already talked to the legislature and told them, this is what will work for us. And they told them 100 years ago and got agreement and somehow. So is state law silent on what we can expect public utilities to do?
There are other jurisdictions that require permitting for utilities. So I don't think that it would be completely unreasonable. Additionally, we have reached out to the utility companies through this process. And I think that they've been relatively amicable to having some type of a notification process. Currently in our code, we do request that they notify us. I can say that doesn't happen often. It's usually after the fact, once we've been notified of a tree being usually trimmed, and the trees are trimmed in such a way that it's unsightly. And so what this would require is that there is a level of review or an expectation, clear guidelines between agencies for what we would like to see for when they maintain our rights of way.
But it's important to note, we can't say no. I mean, we're asking for, we're saying do a permit, but we can't say no to
Correct.
them, right? Because they have the right.
Mhm.
And in fact, we want them to be able to trim their right of way, correct? Okay. Then how does it impact the city?
It would require additional reviews from city staff. So the utility companies would expect.
No,
Sorry.
not our roads.
Oh, okay. So for our roads, an example would be the sidewalk project that just recently went in. There was a Gary Oaks that were removed in that instance. It would be an expectation that built into that project, there would be some type of mitigation outlined ahead of time. So if we removed this number of inches, the ratio we're suggesting is a 2-to-1 ratio. This is how much money is either being deposited into the city's tree fund, or this is where we're replanting trees elsewhere.
Okay. Okay, are you going to talk later about replanting and, okay, well, thank you.
Can I ask a question on that? So on the mitigation of potential impacts on the public rights of way, it seems to me a possible mode of mitigation might be to acquire sufficient right of way to go around the tree.
Mhm.
If it's significant enough, as opposed to just kind of mowing down, in a straight linear fashion, which I think some homeowners would be fine with if that significant tree could be maintained, because there are some interesting trees in the rights of way around here that we have, maneuvered around, so to speak. I'm thinking of some trees off of Decoven and one of those other streets. Could that be a possibility within the code? Okay. Right. Yeah, so if we can go around, have a little bit of a curve, that might accommodate many needs and desires. So, okay.
So the next key issue is around permitting. And currently today, non-exempt activities are reviewed for tree protection with a tree permit. The ad hoc committee didn't have a lot of specifics other than for Gary Oaks, but they did have an overarching keeping permits fair, inexpensive, and simple. They were really concerned about making sure it was easy to comply and that people weren't being unfairly burdened. For Gary Oaks, they wanted to see some review and monitoring by an arborist. The Planning Commission would have a permit for non-exempt development as today. And then as we've been talking through the exemptions, most of the exemptions remain except for Gary Oaks. And this is where there would be that simple over-the-counter type permit. And in some cases, they might need an arborist or certified arborist to review.
Could you just touch on the number of lots that would now be potentially required to get permits?
I don't have that number.
It was something like 17,000, I thought, right? Or 10,000. It was somewhere around the actual square footage numbers, I thought. So it's a decent number of lots, though, to keep in mind that.
Mr. Buer may have it.
I'm not going to address the specific number of lots. We'll go back and check, but I assume it's around a 10,000. We have about 17,000 residential lots in Lakewood alone. I will say that I want to bring to attention the council that we do operate on an 85% cost recovery system. So if you're going to be charging fees for permits for trees, unless you say otherwise, that 85% cost recovery will be something that we would bring back as a part of your fee resolution process to the budget later this year. I did want to bring that to your attention.
So the cost includes not just the permit at a target of 85% cost recovery, but potentially the private arborist to come and help facilitate getting a permit.
So what we had proposed in front of the planning commission was basically two avenues for permitting. One avenue that is that over-the-counter no-cost permit, and it's fair to say that today we have no cost for any tree removal permit regardless of the project scope and size. So for those that are larger developments, it would potentially make sense to include some type of cost recovery model where we recoup some of those costs, especially if it's going to be several trees that, again, require a lot of staff review and expert opinions. For key issue number 6, going into the critical areas ordinance specific to Gary Oaks. So right now, Gary Oaks are mentioned in 2 places in the city's code. We have them in the tree preservation code section, as well as in the critical areas ordinance. Under the tree preservation code, Gary Oaks are considered a significant tree if they're at least 6 inches diameter at breast height. That is different than other trees, which are 9 inches, so they're already slightly smaller. The ad hoc committee recommendation was that we reduce that number from 6 down to 4 inches diameter at breast height. That would be one of the smallest area-wide sizes for oak trees. A Gary oak tree could be as many as 20 years old, though by the time it gets to 4 inches high. So that was some of the background information that led them to making that recommendation. They also, for certain sizes of Gary Oaks at the ad hoc committee, they had recommended that any individual Gary Oak tree 20 inches or more, or a stand 15 inches or more, regardless of stand size, so more than 2 trees, would qualify as a critical area and be subject to the critical area review rather than the tree preservation code review. The planning commission recommendation again was that we keep that 4 inches recommendation from the ad hoc committee, that we establish a heritage tree program within the Landmarks and Heritage Advisory Board, chapter 2.48, and that we do not add single oak trees as critical areas regardless of their size, and that we retain the current critical area definition, which does protect stands of large stands, so over 20 inches average diameter of breast height, as well as that we set up an administrative reasonable use for modest development. Right now, the critical areas ordinance doesn't really give us clear administration guidelines or pathways, nor does the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife Management recommendations. So we've included some language that would establish a process for us to be able to review permits and project proposals when a critical area is proposed to be removed.
Oh, Mr. Branster had a question on number 6.
Yeah, I understand not designating a single tree as a critical area in and of itself. Instead of use stands, but how many trees is a stand?
So it's not defined anywhere clearly. So we consider a stand to be more than 1. So multiple trees, which would be 2 or more.
Is that still with an average of 20 inches?
And how
Diameter.
close together do they have to be? I mean, that would seem to require some after the fact defining to me to be able to go and do that. Okay.
We can bring back some more clarification on the definition of a stand. Typically, 2 trees next to each other would need to share some level of canopy coverage, but it is
Right.
worth noting that one of the unique features of Oregon white oaks is that they are natural to a prairie environment. And so typically prairie lands are also included as some of those larger, like acre or more coverage. You're looking for 25% coverage for Oregon white oaks in an acre. So there is some space there. We'll see what we can find for additional clarity.
So Courtney covered this a bit, but I think it's worth saying on the heritage trees that the idea here would be that it's a voluntary program for it to be considered a heritage tree. Once it would be considered a heritage tree, it would be more protected. But to have it on the list would be voluntary.
For key issue number 8, we've already touched on this a couple of times as well. Today in our code, we have a certain number of trees that can be removed on a lot over 17,000 square feet without a permit. And what the ad hoc committee recommendation was, is that instead of looking at individual trees, we look at the canopy coverage, which is a different way of really evaluating the number of trees on a lot. So looking at your overall canopy coverage and taking a percentage and requiring that a certain percentage of canopy coverage remain on all lots. The Planning Commission recommendation was that we maintain the current standard of individual tree counts and that we do require, again, a permit, though it would be, in theory, this more administrative process that really we just verify that they have not exceeded the number of trees that are permitted to be removed within any given time frame. So the change here would be, rather than saying you can remove a number of trees without a permit, we would say you can remove a number of trees with a permit.
I know we'll get to it as part of it, but it goes to other comments about the administrative and cost burden, potentially both on the city and on individual homeowners. We'll probably have some analysis toward the end on that, because that seems to be, if we've got 10,000 lots or 17,000 lots in the city, that might require some permit work over the course of time. That could be a lot of work.
In front of the Planning Commission, we did bring forward the exact lot counts, and we will certainly bring that back on the 22nd. But what we generally, where we ended up was that it would probably be one full-time person, one FTE for tree removal permits, and then having a contract arborist for those special cases when we needed somebody on staff on our side.
Okay.
In terms of replacement, today the code requires a 2-to-1 replacement of significant trees. So that would be the 6 or 9 inch trees, depending on type, would get the 2-to-1 replacement. And then any other tree, even if it wasn't considered significant, would have a 1-to-1 replacement ratio. The ad hoc committee looked at a few options, including in other jurisdictions, and was considering an approach that was based on no net loss, rather than a specific tree count, with an arborist report. And the Planning Commission recommended retaining 2-to-1 replacement ratio, but that there be a process for an applicant to submit a report that could be something other than 2-to-1, but get to the same place in terms of compensation for the quality of the tree canopy.
Mr. Anderson.
Is the only consideration the canopy coverage, or is there any consideration given to the CO2 sink proficiency of particular species?
There is actually an option in the revised code that with a partnership of a certified arborist, they could demonstrate canopy coverage, and we could give an option for other, administrative determinations to replace like for like.
So it'd be an administrative discretion
Yes.
to replace percentage of canopy with, some species take a lot of CO2 out.
Mhm.
Gary oaks isn't one of them, but they aren't young, fast growing trees. So, but there isn't a specific reference to that. in the
Not to
proposal.
CO2, but it's something, we do have a natural spot that we could include
Okay.
that.
Thank you.
So my question on this, maybe it's my ignorance, but both the ad hoc committee recommendation, the planning commission recommendation talk about replacement. The question is there a requirement for particular maturity or diameter size for replacement? You say 2-to-1. So let's say I've got a large significant maple tree, and I'm bringing in 2 little tiny Japanese maples that are going to be ornamental in their place. Does
These
that
are-
work?
No, these are actually based off of inches. So we would look at the size of a tree, and this is how the code is today as well. So we take the diameter at breast height, we multiply that by 2, and then typical was 3 inches back in the day, but inventory is low for a lot of these tree species. So we do sometimes see 1 or 2 inch saplings being replaced instead of 3-inch trees. But standard replacement ratio is 2 times the total number of inches being removed. And then you divide that by the inches of the trees that you're replacing them with.
So if it's a 15-inch tree,
It'd be 30 inches of replacement.
30
which for
inches of
3 inches would be 10
replacement.
trees.
and it, okay. Okay, at breast height.
Mhm.
So it has to be a decent sized tree. It can't be just a little sap, Okay. So someone would have to have room for 10 trees.
Or there's other options. You can do offsite replacement or the tree mitigation fund.
So those would be options.
Yes.
Okay, that makes some sense, because you may not have, in some of these small lots, you may not have the room, or it might not make sense to have this incredible crowding up against,
Mhm.
foundations and houses that are 5 feet apart.
So. Can I ask the existential question? To what extent in your research, so you just define 2 holes, right? That I want to cut every tree down, I'll just throw money into the fund and I'm go on my way, which is great for a flexibility standpoint. But if the city's goal is to make sure when the next generation of housing law comes out from the legislature, which I think will be very soon, that says sixplexes everywhere. There's a lot of value to that. I mean, if I get to put a sixplex in my yard, right? Which the legislature is doing, statewide zoning. Then I just pay, right? If we give them that loophole, do other cities do that, I guess is my question. Or are other cities just gonna say, no loopholes, work around the trees to try to defeat the legislature's intent to try to put up sixplexes everywhere?
I think the example cities we looked at all had, preference for on-site mitigation, and then if you can't do that, then off-site. I'm not aware of one that said, absolutely, gotta be on site. And I think the idea behind some of the incentives that the planning commissioners talked about was this idea of, well, we'll give you some extra flex on density or height or impervious so that you can protect the trees. So hopefully you get a win-win out of it.
What do most other cities do though? Or I don't know when you want to know most other cities. What do cities that tend to be hostile to development? So what does Mercer Island do? What does Gig Harbor do? What does any of the East Side King County cities do?
For sixplexes specifically, anything over 4 units, we'd be looking at the multifamily code, which would bring in landscaping standards as well. And landscaping standards would require at least 1 perimeter tree every 20 feet for the front of your lot. So minimum lot width is 50 feet. You're looking at least 2 trees just going on the perimeter of the lot, around the perimeter of the lot. So that would be one option. I believe there were some examples and were verified where there was a minimum amount of canopy coverage again on lots. So it would be looking at the total tree preservation in a different way than we do today versus stem count. We'd be looking at canopy coverage.
I just want to make sure that once the law changes, that we won't have, we will have developers come in and start chopping up our neighborhoods because the ground is cheaper than it is in most other cities. So they'll be in here like this. I don't want to have the weakest standards on anything, actually, when it comes to building these things. So I don't want them to be able to go, so I'm standing there next door And I'm like, oh, Bill sold his house. Oh, they're tearing Bill's house down. Oh, they've taken down every bit of landscaping. Oh, hey, can they do that? Oh, yeah, they paid into the fund. Or they did this, or they asked for an exemption, or they went to the hearing examiner, and the hearing examiner said they can pave the hell out of that if he, now it gets to be a bigger question outside of trees. But I want to be careful with this because this is going to happen. I really do believe. And so the question is how bad are these things going to look? And the worse they look, the more abuse that will be heaped on the city. And so I want best practices when it comes to those kind of things. So some of that's outside of this. But I want to keep that in mind that if I can buy my way out, the more the merrier, right? And then use density bonuses to get more, that makes it even easier for me to cut down more trees because now I'm making more money. It just becomes this really kind of horrific cycle, right? Of doing the exact opposite of what we're trying to do here tonight and what the ad hoc committee is doing and what the concerns of the citizens are, which is we want tree preservation. Okay, I've done my speech now, so I'll leave it at that. There's no question there, I guess.
Mr. Anderson.
I kind of like to second Mr. Bulkey's concern, if you go back 25 years, we become a city, one of the biggest concerns people had starting out was the demise of the estate zoning. I mean, the tree canopy around the lakes is exceptional. And we have this zoning that GMA folks don't like at all and have always tried to change. And so once again, the Seattle elites have cross purposes. It's like we want affordable housing, but we're going to put in an energy code that adds a third of the price to the building. So here we go. We need tree cover, but you have to have density. So I think there's a real opportunity if we don't have too much of a buyout option to combat some of that. Here's your own medicine. We're trying to preserve the environment, but really what we're doing is trying to preserve the character of Lakewood, which is not. I had an uncle that grew up in West Seattle. And if you go to West Seattle, especially down by Alki, that used to be rows of little craftsman houses that working people lived in that were less than 1,000 square feet. And now they're blocks, multiplexes with no parking. And that remaining craftsman home stands out like a sore thumb. Where I think it's Granville, main drag, in going into Vancouver, BC. Same thing, little houses go out and the Chinese immigrants fleeing Hong Kong at the turnover came and built wall to wall 10, 15,000 square foot houses. And then they were covered up everything. It's not pretty. And so I don't think it's just about trees. I think it's about overall character. And so we have to watch out for those unintended consequences like allowing for density bonuses and buying out, which would be across purposes with the goal to maintain the tree canopy and the character of the community.
Don't make it too easy. Good feedback. Next one.
So currently today, for those offsite replacements or can't be located offsite, we have something called the city's tree fund where folks can pay a mitigation fee in lieu of replanting trees on site or an identified offsite location. The ad hoc committee recommendation, the question that we posed to the ad hoc committee was where should these fees be allocated to? And right now in our code, there is a list. And the ad hoc committee proposed that we expand that list to include the enhancement of native trees, including Gary Oaks, and then enhancement of trees in private tree tracts, critical area buffers, and land conservation easements. The Planning Commission took that recommendation and expanded it further to include that any funds could go to support the Tree Preservation Code program, as well as include the restoration and enhancement of native trees, including Gary oaks.
Yeah, I'm not quite clear what the planning commission recommendation is in light of the fact that the tree permit fees are expected to essentially fund the 85% cost recovery of the staff effort of the permitting process. And that mixing those together, such as, or further on, it talked about that the staff, the cost of the permitting process would come out of the tree fund. And I think that I really rather that the tree fund stay focused on the things like it is now, and that the permitting fees go into a separate account that is actually, like other fees, it goes into the cost recovery of the costs of running that permitting program to be able to go and do that. Because otherwise, I think we're going to end up having the danger of, well, if we didn't collect enough money to meet the 85%, we'll tap into the other sources of the tree fund for administrative costs. And I'd rather keep them separate, as other permit fees are sort of kept separate to be able to use to offset the costs they're intended to. But that the tree fund also, those dollars on the mitigations and grants and things goes for what they're intended to and not mixed together.
That's going to be interesting, right? To figure that out. You had a question, Ms. Farmer?
I wanted to ask a clarifying question because it looks like between the ad hoc committee recommendation and the planning commission recommendations that they're looking for explicit funding purpose. Currently, it looks like we can use the money on a lot of different things that are not necessarily increasing the tree canopy, restoring. So I'm curious of the direction. It looks like they're looking to narrow the focus.
On page 52 of the council packet, we have this portion of the red lines. And so today it reads City Tree Fund, and it gives some options for where the revenue is generated from and then what it is used towards. What the ad hoc committee recommended was that a couple of items be added to both of those sections. And then the planning commission said, we want to add another item to that section as well. So they expanded on the list that already exists for the City Tree Fund.
And maybe I missed it, coordinate a little bit here. Are we going to be able to have something of value in the fund for an explicit funding purpose other than 85% mitigation back to the city's general fund?
Yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
You take your permit, and suppose that goes into the total permit system process. That's going to be separate. So if you're paying for mitigation, that mitigation is going to go into the tree fund.
Got it.
Or additional penalties. And this is all caveated by May. So I would say that those allocations are dependent on
Okay.
council allocations.
Great.
They are also funding that means that they
Got it. Okay.
Mhm.
Kind of like the right of way mitigation example I just gave, right? We have to go around something significant down the road. We'd have funding for it.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Got it. Mr. Anderson.
So I'm thinking of a particular property in the very south end of Lakewood in Tillicum. There's a former Presbyterian center that was spun off to a different church when you go into Camp Murray off to the right. And there's a significant oak grove on the vacant parcel of land that's bigger than the actual improved part. Are you suggesting that it could be used for things like buying the development rights to that, saying you have to maintain the oak grove, you can have your picnic out there and still own it, but we're going to diminish the value of the property and pay you for it? Not a conservation easement. Then you don't have to take care of it.
Mhm.
And the amendments give the flexibility for you to grant that approval.
Great, we're getting there.
Okay, second to last. Key issue 11, fines.
So today, the city has collected fines where there's been violations, but sometimes the value of those fines has been reduced through the courts. And so we did look at different city examples with the ad hoc committee and with the planning commission. The ad hoc committee came back with sort of a comprehensive discussion. First was a free or low cost tree permit to make compliance easy. So to try to minimize violations. And then having clear decision criteria, including the potential for denial. And then increasing penalties for non-compliance was another arena. And they wanted the penalty to apply to both the property owner and to the contractor. And one of the city examples we looked at had an administrative appeal of the fine where the hearing examiner couldn't reduce it by more than 30%. So they were trying to maintain the effect of having a penalty. So that's similar to where the planning commission landed, except again, as we've noted along the way, that the permit would be for the typically exempt items would be more for the Gary Oak. So it would be focused there. There would be approval required prior to the removal of any significant tree. And there would be decision criteria and construction standards. And then in terms of enforcement, there would be up to triple fees for malicious removal.
And it's worth mentioning that when we've taken these cases to court in the past, the typical fee reduction that we have seen is reduced down to 1/3. So the tripling would be recovering those costs should those reductions continue.
It's kind of consistent with the timber trespass statute too, right? On private property. There's a triple damage component.
So our final key issue for this evening, and then we'll move on to a couple of scenarios, is regarding incentives. The current code, we do not have any explicit incentives for tree preservation. The ad hoc committee recommended some incentives. And to summarize, the planning commission recommendation was that we add even additional incentives. And on the 22nd, we will review the full list of what those incentives are, but they would apply citywide and apply directly to our existing development regulations.
How would you? somebody's developing, how would you measure what they are doing to get the incentive?
So basically, it would be by incentive, if they can remove a tree on the property, we would say, if you keep that tree, you can reduce your landscaping elsewhere, or you can have one less parking space, or potentially you can have a slightly higher density, or there was some conversation regarding stormwater credits, a lot of different incentive options for if they choose to keep a tree that they could otherwise potentially remove.
So first you have to make a decision as to whether they would be entitled to remove it.
Correct.
And then you have some sort of metric that you apply to the amount of, I guess it isn't mitigation, the amount of status, the extent to which they maintain the status quo over the minimum requirements,
Mhm.
has some metric applied to it and they get a credit for that.
And then they could, in theory, have additional flexibility. And the permit criteria would outline the number that they could remove versus the number that we would propose that they try to maintain by doing a different site design. And one of the criteria would be that you've exhausted all of these incentives before we could deny a tree removal permit or send it off to a reasonable use
So
exception process.
Mr. Buer and Mr. Caulfield can cover their ears for this one. You know, most effective incentive is not necessarily, we might not want a density bonus. Most effective incentive is cash. You don't have to pay as much for a permit. You get permit credit.
Mhm.
Well, maybe that's something we can consider.
Mr. Buer and then Deputy Mayor Moss.
Mhm. Mhm.
I mean, the wonderful thing is if we actually had density in the sub-area plans that we planned for in the central business district and the transit-oriented development area that are mostly asphalt currently, we'd probably do just dandy, right, on both counts. Deputy Mayor Moss.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm not quite clear how the courts reduce the cost when they, that you just stated. I'm not clear on that.
So when we take these into municipal court, right now, we don't have a process for a hearing examiner. These citations are assigned when individuals remove trees that they should not have removed without permits. And we assign the fee based off of what the fee would have been, because we don't have a code process otherwise, if they had come in with a permit and chose to do offsite replacement or pay into the tree mitigation fund. They disagree whether or not they want to appeal or want to pay that fee. They come to court and they request that it be reduced, and the judge typically reduces that to a third of the initial fine.
So they can reduce. Mr. Brihan.
Or the municipal court upholds the fee and then they appeal to Superior Court where we seem to have less control. That's where the reductions have occurred in the past.
So they can do that without interfering with the procedures that the city has in place.
Correct, because right now we don't have a separate procedure to charge more for illegal tree removal.
Thank you.
One comment, I'm looking at the resolution the planning commission made to us. I assume when this ultimately comes to us, we will have some sort of whereas clauses in advance of us adopting our own legislation with this code. Seems to me it would be appropriate to do a tie-in with the climate change chapter that we've adopted and talk about the importance of climate change work and how this dovetails and fits into a component of it, just so we kind of tie in the two policy objectives. Go ahead.
So I've prepared a couple of scenarios for this evening. Scenario one is if an applicant were to live on a 20,000 square foot lot and wanted to remove 2 maple trees, are they permitted to remove the trees? Under the current code, yes, yes, it is your hypothetical. Yeah, and currently today there would be no permit required, no tracking required. Under the proposed code, a permit would be required, and I'm sorry for the formatting on this But you can see we would essentially receive the application, we would verify that the removal adheres to the code. So if we say that you can remove X number over 5 years, assuming that you haven't already met that threshold, we would sign off on the permit and send you on your way to remove those trees. If you had already met that threshold, or through this review criteria, we found that it was located in a critical area, additional review may be required, and that's when we may require an ISA certified arborist or additional staff time to review those permits. But short answer would be yes, no permit required under the current code. A permit would be required under the revised code based off of the lot size. Scenario 2, an applicant lives on a 15,000 square foot lot and wants to move 3 oak trees, all located on his property. Each oak is over 20 inches. Are they permitted to remove those trees? So again, 20 inches are those individual trees that are large and protected by WDFW standards. Under the current code, yes, and no permit would be required, again, because lots under 17,000 square feet are exempt from tree preservation. Under the proposed code, a permit would be required, an application would be received. We would review the request and determine if it was required, given the administrative reasonable use development. So we've developed some criteria. Basically, is it for a driveway? Is it for a certain size garage? What is been defined as reasonable in the critical areas ordinance? And then to remove that tree, we would say, yes, you can, but mitigation is required at a 2-to-1 ratio. And if the answer was no, then there would also be an option for them to move forward with a reasonable use exception, which would go before a hearings examiner.
Interjecting a question. It's going to be interesting to see how our policy to advance housing density with ADUs in every residential zone will impact these requests and permits and mitigation choices. Because that's going to be where you're going to see these internal lots having challenges with trees.
In the revised code, we included ADUs and garages up to 1,000 square feet each as being part of that reasonable use to be able to
Absolutely.
remove a tree.
Yep. Mr. Branstetter.
What would be an example of an unreasonable
I don't like the
request?
leaves.
In other words, you decide whether it is for an administrative reasonable use development. And so what would cause that answer to be no?
Okay, the applicant has demonstrated no alternative siting in order to construct streets, utilities, or other on-site improvements. And then those improvements, again, are the 1,000 square foot for an ADU, a garage, and I believe it's 1,500 square feet for the ground floor of a single-family residence. And then we would also request as part of the findings that they have shown that they cannot utilize the many incentives provided in order to meet the development.
So the mayor said, too many leaves would be unreasonable.
Correct.
My wife is frightened because it's too close to the house. That's more of a gray area, I think.
We would require an arborist report basically to come in and say that it was damaging some type of infrastructure. And then if it was determined to be hazardous or potentially damaging property, then it could be removed. But without any type of professional verification, we wouldn't allow for it to be removed under the revised code.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Boki.
Okay, so this is a case where they would probably have to pay into some kind of mitigation because you have 2 20-inch trees, that's 40 inches of oak. Tree removal at 2-to-1 would make, they'd have to buy 80 inches of new tree at breast height. So unless they have a huge lot, really, they would have to pay into this mitigation fund. Is that
Correct,
correct?
or go offsite.
So then how do you value the mitigation fund? Like if I can, hey, I can do half of it. Let's say oh, I got plenty of room in the back. I'll put up a few trees back there. Okay, great. But the other half, I don't have enough room for. 20 years, they'll be so huge anyway. So then are you charging by tree? I mean, how do you come up with a valuation?
Sure. So we encounter this already, and it's actually outlined in the fee schedule. The cost of a replacement tree is $400. So we would look at the number of trees that they were proposing to replace on site or off site, and sometimes the plans are kind of complex. And then whatever the balance would be of the trees that can't be replaced on site or off site, they would pay into the tree mitigation fee.
Anything further on this? We're creating a new branch of local government. Thank you. Yep.
Okay, so this one came up at the very end of the last planning commission meeting. Property owner lives on a 15,000 square foot lot, would like to remove a single oak tree. This oak is part of a large stand that spreads across several neighboring properties, many of which are over 20 inches. So it's possible that the average DBH is over 20 inches. Can they remove the tree? The current code is yes, no permit required. The proposed code would be yes, but a tree removal permit would be required, and mitigation again would be at that 2-to-1 ratio. Same scenario, but with 2 oak trees. The process becomes a little bit more complicated because it's then considered a stand rather than just that individual oak. Under the current code, no permit would be required. Under the proposed code, going through the same steps that we've already outlined. Basically, we would determine first if it was a critical area and then review it administratively and either see if it fits the reasonable use administrative exception or if they need to move forward and apply for a reasonable use exception. Scenario 4, a developer has applied to develop a new commercial center. There is a priority white oak woodland on site over 1 acre in size. The developer would like to remove the woodland in its entirety. Under the current code, we have no clear criteria. Mitigation and habitat is assessed during SEPA, and the city is required to hire a third party in order to assist us coming up with mitigation criteria. Under the proposed code, we would no longer have this be administrative. Instead, we would have the applicant apply for a reasonable use exception once a priority white oak woodland of over 1 acre in size was identified on site. That's what would trigger the reasonable use exception criteria.
We talked about trimming when we were talking about utilities. Is there any restriction on trimming on private property?
For individual trees, no, it's more so that we've defined trimming. And then there would be a permit for oak tree specific trimming to ensure that it's being done by a contractor that essentially is able to perform the work without damaging the tree.
Here's where I think that gets difficult. Is there any attempt to regulate ugly as opposed to healthy?
In the sense that we.
People don't like the way trees are trimmed. It isn't,
Mhm.
but you can trim a tree in a manner which maintains the health of the tree. Your neighbor thinks it's ugly, so they complain to the city. So there's another unintended consequence if we try to regulate the sightliness as opposed to healthiness. We're going to have neighbors complaining about neighbors trimming their tree. So I just want to be careful about that.
I would say that the designation isn't clear for any tree species except for Oregon white oaks. And then for Oregon white oaks, it would have to be monitored by a certified arborist and permitted to ensure that it needs to be trimmed and that the trimming is done in a way that doesn't damage the tree, but no other permitting requirements for other species.
You say it needs to be trimmed,
Yes.
or it can be trimmed without harming the health of the tree. For example, as a tree matures, it takes the sun away from your patio and changes the character of your backyard. Or branches pop out a different place and now it's dropping leaves in your gutter in the second story and you're 80 years old and you can't get them clean. because you can't afford to pay for it anymore. So there are all sorts of things that
Mhm.
happen as a tree grows.
Or the weight gets off kilter
But-
with the branch.
Yeah.
Sometimes the weight gets off kilter.
Yeah, or you do want to trim it for sightliness because it's lopsided. I just concerned that we start regulating needs and sight instead of health of the tree and the relative preservation of the canopy, that we're just asking for trouble. We're gonna have the same people that have advocated saving every tree in Lakewood running around saying, he took a branch off, line them.
Yeah, true. Yeah, we need to kind of accommodate that. We want to avoid armchair quarterbacking by every white oak tree lover in the city of Lakewood over and above the discretion provided to the community development
Mhm.
department. So it'll be interesting.
And that concludes our scenarios and what we have prepared for you
Great.
this evening. We have some appendix slides for if there were certain questions that got brought up, we would be prepared to give you some of that information. But otherwise, we'll be back before you on August 22nd with answers to some of the questions and some additional details on the number
Great.
of lots impacted.
Briefly, Mr. Bokey.
Eloquent on trees. So when are we going to talk about the idea of what was discussed just a little while ago? When we talked about some kind of mitigation efforts, especially on the east side of the city where there seems to be less tree canopy coverage. And what kind of options can we discuss trying to create some additional tree canopy in those areas? Is that part of this discussion?
The city manager has already directed staff to begin to evaluate replacement programs for trees. And we have identified 8 census tracts that are currently receiving a lower tree equity score as potential areas to target those replantings, but other opportunities and options are being evaluated by staff right now.
Okay, thank you.
Well, yeah, Mr. Pearson.
Just one, so one of the items that got brought up during our many reviews was there was like 3 or 4 different items that Planet Geo had provided as far as costs on. Right now, we don't know how many trees we have or where they are, or what kind there are. And there was, you know, the Bentley approach to tree counting, which was literally having people go out with whatever and surveying, getting, I mean, it was like $2 million or something, like go count all the trees in the city. And then there was some other form of that was like maybe $500,000 for only doing it in parks and right of ways. And then there was this $4,500 option that involved them using technology and getting a pretty, it seemed a very accurate tree count in the city. And that to me seemed like just a no-brainer. It's like, go do that, get a starting point. Now we know where, you know, what trees are on each lot. It's helping staff regulate. They're not having to go out and do site visits to like go count trees. They've got all of this. And, you know, if you're concerned about how many trees you're cutting down every year, every 5 years, and that's, you know, without getting permits, and maybe you do that every 5 years and, you know, you have some baseline. So
Is that a canopy coverage issue or an actual count?
It's a count. So it's
Okay.
a tree inventory that's performed using GIS and satellite imaging.
So we'll probably see more information on that and in the budget process we're going to be undertaking this fall.
Correct. One thing we didn't really touch on this week, but we will on the 22nd is the establishment of an urban forestry program and what such a program might look like and what
Great.
some work items would be, including maintaining and
Got it.
having a canopy.
I just want to conclude by saying thank you. I know this has been a huge amount of work on the part of our planning commission members and certainly our staff and our consultant and Mr. Buer and Mr. Gotfield and everyone. So thank you for the significant work. Really, it's been a good process. I think it has been quite good. There's been a lot of public input and interest, obviously. So we're all trying to do the right thing, but your significant work is certainly going to help us in that policy direction. So again, thank you very, very much for all of that work. Yeah, good to see you and thank you for staying, both of you. And Courtney, really yeoman's work on everything you've done. Thank you very much for that. Okay, well, we do have an executive session later tonight, so I want to breeze through this. Items tentatively scheduled for the August 15 regular city council meeting include those items on your sheet and agenda, as you can see. And we'll now turn to the brief report by the city manager.
So I had 6 items here. However, I am only going to jump to the last one.
You are so kind, Mr. Coffin.
Sooner you stop clapping, the sooner I'll be done.
Yeah.
I think as I had mentioned to you in some phone calls last week, myself, our deputy city manager and our communications manager went out and participated in Lancer Day with our community connector, the 2-2 Stryker Brigade. And this body on an annual basis up until 2019 would host a dinner event with the leadership team of the Stryker Brigade. And so I had a chance to talk to Colonel Rorman, and his folks, his team are interested in doing that. The challenge is based on their calendar. Typically, the council's done this in late October or into November, but they're not available. And so we wanted to have you check your calendars to see if Friday, September 23rd or Friday, September 30th would work. And if so, we're in the process of confirming with the colonel on his end. And then I know the mayor and I were talking and perhaps doing it over at the country club. Of course, if there was any other options, we'd be open to that. In the past, we had done it at Thornwood Castle, but they've had a change in ownership and operations over there. And so the person that kind of hosted us, actually personally hosted us, I think you're aware, she passed away a couple of years ago. So that's why we're looking at perhaps the country club. So, but with that, if you could let me know one way or the other, if that, I know a couple of you have already said that works. Okay. It would be Friday, and it would be either the 23rd or the 30th. Oh, and by the way, it would be, yourselves and your spouses as well. So,
Great.
okay.
Is
So
that
that's
it?
Yes, sir. Okay, fine. Saturday, we have awesome roads, Councilmember Boki. On Saturday is the street festival, and the theme is Jazz Nights. There'll be a car show out there, and it's from 4 to 8 p.m. I'm sorry, I stand corrected. So I also wanted to point out on behalf of the mayor, we do have uplighting. It's right there. Horrible.
So we have a what? Oh, I thought you were talking about the art out on Grantley in Washington. Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
But with that, Mayor, that's my report.
Thank you. Any questions of the city manager before we let him loose? Great. All right, we'll have city council comments. Mr. Boki.
I've only got one thing to say. The Phillips Road project is coming along very nicely, and tonight, as I was driving here to this meeting, someone was skateboarding on the new sidewalks already. So
Great.
I thought that was a positive development. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, I drove down there twice over the weekend. Looks great. My only question for the city manager might be the stump. Are they going to grind those stumps that are kind of hanging out there as part of the finalization of that project, or they're not going to pull them, obviously, because there are already sidewalks in place?
I'm sure they'll do some cleanup work out there, Mayor.
Got it. Okay, great. Mr. Brandstetter. Good. Councilmember Bell.
Good, thank you.
Fantastic. Councilmember Farmer. Mr. Anderson.
Just note that though there were a limited number of national night out events, they seem to be successful and well attended and engaged people. So coming back from COVID, there's still some indicated reluctance to come together in groups, especially when some of the population that participates in that tends to be older. So
I was going to comment on National Night Out. I thought it went well. I had the chance to meet with Congresswoman Strickland and members of her staff out at American Lake Park. She was very appreciative of the opportunity to come out to Lakewood. And then we raced back to my own neighborhood association meeting, which we kind of stood up, and they were very appreciative of the members of West Pierce and the city police department and other staff members that showed up. So it was a good event, and I hope to grow it as we talked about with the Public Safety Advisory folks tonight. That would be a good thing to do. Okay, there being no further comments except from the deputy mayor. I thought you gave me the nod.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
I always do this just to trigger.
I too, enjoyed the National Night Out. I think the people that were participated enjoyed and was happy to see us coming around too. Tonight I attended the Legion's social. And what that is 5 retired officers that are coming back and to kind of carry on the legacy of the Air Force. So it's a beginning of a new program that they're starting up. So it sounds like it's going to be a lot of fun, but that's what that was about tonight. It had a good turnout.
Can I hear congrats?
Colonel Buck and Colonel Wesley were 2 of the ones that were there. There was 5 of them there, but there were the 2 who spoke.
And congrats are in order for the next honorary wing
Well-
commander yet again.
Actually, we submitted an application. We haven't got the yes yet.
It's great.
Yeah, but I'm excited. It's a lot of fun to do.
Yeah.
And the other thing on the sour note, I hate to end on a sour note, but we put a new bridge in the University Place area.
Mhm.
We heard the complaints at Turquoise about the home break-ins and invasion of properties. We have had 4 break-ins in Chambers Gardens in the last 2 weeks,
Are they coming up from the
coming up from the
canyon?
canyon there. Mhm.
Okay.
And it's happening during the day. But they stand on that lower side so far. They stand there on the lower side by the creek. So just wanted to put that out there because they come and knocking on my door
That's
to
not
see
good
what we
news.
can do. Yeah,
For University Place residents
that's right.
that are lost.
Yes. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. Thank you for your indulgence. Okay, so we will recess into executive session for approximately 30 minutes pursuant to RCW 4230-110-1G to review the performance of a public employee. We're not expected to take action following the executive session other than to adjourn the meeting. So at this time, we'll recess into executive session.